Things are getting intense behind the scenes for the Miami Dolphins because we are now just days away from one of the toughest moments of the entire preseason, the final 53-man roster decisions. And trust me, there are some choices here that could surprise a lot of Dolphins fans. We already know the preseason finale against the Atlanta Falcons is coming up, and right after that, Miami has to decide who stays, who goes, and who still has a future with this team. ESPN released its final 53-man roster projection, and while some names feel obvious, others immediately caught my attention. At quarterback, Malik Willis and Quinn Ewers are projected to make the team, but there is still a big question about whether Miami is completely satisfied with that room. At running back, Carlos Washington Jr. suddenly appears as a possible fourth option. On defense, names like Jackson Woodard, Matthew Butler, Robert Beal Jr. and Clelin Ferrell are part of some very difficult decisions. And this is where I want to hear from you. Which player do you believe Miami absolutely cannot afford to cut? Write that name in the comments right now, because I have a feeling Dolphins fans are going to be very divided on this one. And if you have been supporting the Miami Dolphins for more than 15 years, hit that like button hard. Let's see how many longtime Dolphins fans are really here with us. Now, let's get straight into this ESPN projection, because some of these decisions make sense, and some of them could completely change before the final roster is announced. This is going to be a very important week for the Miami Dolphins. The preseason finale against the Atlanta Falcons is coming up Friday, and then roster cut-down day arrives Sunday. That means there is almost no time left for players fighting for those final spots to change the minds of the coaches. ESPN has released its final Dolphins 53-man roster projection heading into the weekend, and while a lot of the choices make sense, there are also some surprising decisions that could create serious debate among Dolphins fans. We have to start at quarterback, where there really is no surprise in the projection. Malik Willis and Quinn Ewers are the two quarterbacks ESPN has Miami keeping on the initial 53-man roster. But even if those are the two names who survive cut-down day, there's still a feeling that Miami may not be finished at the position. Once cuts happen around the league and waivers clear, the Dolphins could have another opportunity to add somebody. Teams normally want an emergency third quarterback available on the practice squad, and Miami could even decide that a third quarterback deserves a spot on the 53. The concern is that Ewers has not shown enough yet to completely remove the questions behind Willis. Cam Miller and Mark Gronowski have not done enough either to make the situation feel settled. That leaves open the possibility that Miami looks outside the building, whether through a trade, a waiver claim, or a signing after other teams make their cuts. So even though ESPN's two-quarterback projection looks simple right now, this could be one position where the picture changes very quickly after Sunday. Running back is where the first real surprise shows up. Devon Achane, Ollie Gordon II, and Jalen Wright are all included, and there's nothing shocking about those three. The interesting name is Carlos Washington Jr., who gives ESPN's projected roster 4 running backs. Washington has apparently done some good things during training camp. He has made plays while working with the second-team offense at times, and has also seen plenty of work with the third team. The question is whether that is enough to justify using one of only 53 roster spots on a fourth running back. Through the first 2 preseason games against the Washington Commanders and New York Giants, he has not made a major impact in game action. That is why this becomes more than a conversation about Washington himself. Every roster spot used in one position removes a spot somewhere else. Would Miami be better served keeping another edge rusher, another defensive lineman, maybe another offensive lineman, considering some of the concerns about depth there? Washington making the team would not be an unreasonable decision, especially if the Dolphins really like what they have seen from him in practice. But carrying 4 running backs may be difficult to justify when there are other positions that could need those numbers more. At wide receiver, ESPN has Miami keeping 6. Malik Washington, Jalen Tolbert, A.J. Henning, Caleb Douglas, Chris Bell, and Kevin Coleman Jr. 6 receivers has been a common number in these projections, and one of the most interesting developments has been Henning continuing to receive support because of what he has done in practice. Caleb Douglas has also emerged during the summer, while Chris Bell's return gives Miami another young option after he recovered quickly enough to get back into the mix. That creates a very young-looking group around Washington and Tolbert, with Douglas, Bell, and Coleman all giving Miami developmental options. Henning being included should not really be viewed as a major surprise anymore. He has consistently made plays during camp, and has created enough positive attention to put himself in a real position to make this roster. The veteran who does not make ESPN's group is Tutu Atwell, and based strictly on what has happened this summer, that exclusion is difficult to argue with. Atwell has not made enough of an impact, and drops during the preseason have not helped his case. At this point, keeping a younger receiver who has actually created momentum during camp appears to make more sense than using a spot on a veteran who has not separated himself.
At tight end, ESPN goes with Greg Dulcich, Will Kaczmarek, Seydou Traoré, and Ben Sims. There is not much controversy there. DJ Herman is not included as a fullback, while Sims is expected to be capable of taking some fullback reps once he is healthy. Compared with some of the other position groups, this feels like one of the more straightforward areas of the projection. Then we get to the offensive line, and this is where the numbers become uncomfortable. ESPN projects Miami to keep only 8 offensive linemen. That means the 5 starters with just 3 reserves, Caden Wallace, DJ Campbell, and Andrew Meyer. 8 feels extremely light. Charlie Heck is left off the projection, and his preseason performance has certainly opened the door for that possibility. He has struggled badly, so nobody should be shocked if Miami eventually decides it can upgrade that roster spot. But there is a difference between believing Heck should be safe and believing Miami should carry only 8 offensive linemen. One possibility is that Miami could initially keep Heck through cut-down day and then replace him if a better player becomes available after cuts around the league. That would at least give the Dolphins another body while they evaluate the waiver wire and free agent market. Going into the season with only 3 reserve offensive linemen creates risk, especially when Austin Jackson has dealt with injuries before. And that brings us to the defense, where some of the biggest disagreements with ESPN's projection begin. On the interior defensive line, ESPN keeps only 4 players: Zach Sealer, Kenneth Grant, Jordan Phillips, and Zeke Biggers. On pure talent, that 4-man group looks strong. The problem is not necessarily the quality. The problem is the number. Grant was seen moving around Dolphins practice on a scooter, creating uncertainty about his availability. If there is any real chance that Grant is not ready for Week 1, carrying only 4 interior defensive linemen would mean Miami could potentially enter the opener with just 3 available players at that position. That feels difficult to believe. Matthew Butler is the name to watch here. If Grant's situation remains uncertain, keeping Butler as a 5th defensive lineman would give Miami protection and prevent the team from entering the regular season extremely thin inside. ESPN may ultimately be correct about the top 4, but that does not automatically mean 4 is the correct total. The edge rusher projection is probably the biggest reason to question ESPN's version of this roster.